When I was in elementary school, maybe in first or second grade, we got a dog named Lady. And my dad was the one who went and picked her out. There was a older subdivision across the highway from the subdivision that we had moved into and where my mom and dad built a house. And it took a while for ours to fill up. And there was a German Shepherd that apparently had, a litter of puppies from a black labrador. And so a lot of them had the typical kind of German Shepherd pointed ears and tail and stuff like that, but they were all black with, some other things. Like ours, Lady had a little white stripe down her front. And so my dad went, I think there was like maybe an ad in the paper. We'd wanted a dog for a while. We'd had a dog previously, a beagle named Mandy, who went to the proverbial farm after, I think my sister had probably messed with it, and then she got bit, and so that dog went away. But Lady was a puppy when we got her, and, she had to be house trained, and we took her outside, and she became really, everybody's dog within the family. And she and I were particularly close. She would often sleep in my bed, and I was the one who would have to wake up with her when she wanted to go out early in the morning or in the middle of the night and go downstairs and let her outside and then wait till she came back in. Sometimes actually go out and look for her as well. And those are some other stories. The story that I'm going to tell this time has to do with a terrible accident that happened. And I would say she was probably 4 years old when it happened. Maybe 5. I know I was in middle school at the time, and so it must have been during 6th grade, the year before my dad died. And what ended up happening was it was probably November or so, and we lived in this subdivision which wasn't particularly well lit at night, and we're right on the main road, Glacier Pass, and she's a black dog. So one of the neighbors ended up probably driving too fast and ended up hitting Lady with their car. And Lady, after she was hit, and animals will frequently do this, she ran about maybe 100 yards into our backyard, close to where our property adjoined our neighbor's property, and then she fell down. And the neighbor came and let us know what was going on. At least they didn't do a hit and run. They actually felt pretty awful about what had happened. And so, my dad and my mom went out, and of course me and my sister as well. And, she was laying on the ground. We didn't know what had actually happened or how bad the damage was. So my dad said, okay, we're going to take her to the emergency vet. You, meaning me, you stay with her and just keep talking to her. And, we're going to put a blanket on her, try to keep her awake and attentive and comfortable as much as you can. And, my sister, I think, if I remember right, she was in tears. I was close to tears myself. But I knew that it was important, just like when somebody has a concussion, Lady was in shock. And so I just sat with her and petted her and talked to her. And I was very, very worried about, her dying. We had no idea how bad the damage was. We knew that she couldn't move. And so maybe she was paralyzed. As it was going to turn out, she had some pretty extensive damage. So, eventually my dad and a couple of the neighbor men, who lived next door to us, managed to go over and get a blanket underneath her and then pick her up and took her to our station wagon. And they drove off to the emergency veterinarian, which I want to say was a good ways away, like in Waukesha. We lived on the border of Delafield and Wales at the time, so we're talking about, about half an hour drive. And then, he came back later on to pick us up, and we went there, and the vet explained to us, because the vet had checked her out, that in some respects she was kind of lucky. She hadn't had any bad internal organ damage, like, her kidneys were okay, liver was okay, all of that sort of stuff. But the car, when it hit her, had shattered her hip. And so it was pretty bad damage. And I remember being there in the brightly lit, what would you call it, like the reception area. And my mom was there, my dad was there, my sister was there. And my dad said to us, listen, we're going to have to make a big decision. Should we have the vet put her to sleep because she's suffering and, we don't know if she's actually going to get better, or should we have her get an operation? It's going to be a pretty extensive operation. They're going to have to give her a fake hip, a false hip made out of plastic and stuff like that. And we were like, well, we should give her the fake hip. And then he said, there's another wrinkle. It's going to be very expensive. So you kids need to decide, are we going to have Christmas this year, or are we going to repair Lady's hip? And both of us were like, screw Christmas. We don't care if we get any presents. This will be the present to us, fixing her hip. And so, that's what we in effect did. And she was in the surgery. They actually did put in a fake hip. And within a couple days, she was able to come home. And when she came home, her side had been shaved where they had the operation, and there were stitches and all of that. And she was long past being in shock, but you could say she was both in pain, and we had pain relievers for her, and I guess you could just call it depression. She was dispirited. She would just lay down and not do much of anything. She would let you pet her. She might, lift her head up and lick your hand a little bit, but that was about it. And she was drinking water, but she wasn't eating her food at all. And so we were pretty worried that she was going to effectively starve herself and die. So what ended up happening was I was the person who was probably the closest to her, and then my dad as well. But my dad was at work all the time, And so I remember coming home after school one day and going to check on Lady, and she still wasn't eating. So I got her food out and, came up next to her and cuddled with her and just held the food under her face. And eventually she started licking at it and sniffing and then started eating it. And for the first couple days, she would only eat out of my hand. Nobody else's. She'd only eat like that. And so I would sit there with her and, reach into the food dish, get it out. And she was so dispirited. But then she got her strength back and started to, do the things that she needed to do, like moving around the house and going outside to go to the bathroom. And she was so stiff at first, which, understandable. I mean, this is the early 1980s. So I don't think they had all of these transplant operations down very well for humans, let alone for animals. And, it took quite a while for her to get her full strength and speed and flexibility back, but she did. And she lived a number of years after that, well into my high school years, and, she could run and jump and do all those things. Every once in a while, her hip would give her some trouble, the hip that had been replaced. But for the most part, she was able to get by. The hair grew back in, and she did quite well. Unfortunately, my dad would die in 1982, so he didn't get to see all of the recovery of Lady and all the things that she was able to do later as she grew into an older dog. But it was really quite a unusual thing. I think a lot of people back then would have not even given it a thought. They probably wouldn't even taken her to the vet to be euthanized. They would have just, gotten a gun and shot her in the back of the head. People had a very different attitude about animals back then. But, it was important to my parents that we make a decision as a family about whether to stick with her, whether to treat her as a pet or as an actual member of the family. And that's what we were given the option for, and that's what we chose to do. As it turned out, we did have some Christmas presents that year. It was very, very few compared to other years. We had some things in our stockings. We had a few presents. But the big present was, of course, getting to have Lady alive and this expensive operation that I think a lot of people would have passed on, including a lot of kids probably. That's one of those things where you really get to see what people value and how they make decisions about important matters. So I think it's something that I would say made quite an impact on me. And, much later on, I'm this person who volunteers at a cat shelter, married a woman who had adopted rescue animals, and they became my animals, those 2 cats and 2 dogs, Teensy and Sassy, Magnus and Amika. And I think that's always been something quite important to me, and that was one of those juncture points where the family could have gone this way or it could have gone this way. And we decided as a family that saving Lady's life and giving her back mobility was a top priority for us. I was just thinking about that the other day. Maybe I'll tell some other stories about Lady down the line, but I was thinking about how determinative this was, the choice to spend the money, spend the time, and how helpless she was when she came back, how despondent and despairing she was as a young dog, a dog in her prime who now had this, very intrusive operation and didn't know what to make of it. And she could have died after that, just starving and not thriving. But we as a family did what we needed to do to see her through it. So that's the story. Again, I'll probably tell more stories about Lady as I have with my other animal companions over time, but that's where this one ends.